listening to The Olive Tree with me, Julia Fisher. The aim of this programme is to introduce you to Arab Christians and Jewish believers living in Israel to tell the stories of what God is doing in the region despite the ongoing threats, both from within and outside the country. Today, my guest is Shahal. She was born and grew up on a kibbutz in Israel. So I began by asking her to describe her early life.
Well, it's a great growing up environment in terms of like the whole area of the kibbutz is like your home and everyone there is family. And so that's a great experience. Basically, you're always safe wherever you go. You don't have to be afraid of cars in the streets or anything because there hardly are any cars. It's a great environment to grow up in.
Did you see a lot of your parents, or were you put in a kindergarten from a very young age?
Well, when I was born, it was already at a stage where I was at home from 4 p.m. for the rest of the day. But when my brother was growing up, he was sleeping in the children's home much more. And when my dad was growing up, he didn't hardly see his parents at all. So it kind of evolved.
Such an interesting history of the kibbutz, because of course that's how the state of Israel really founded itself, wasn't it, on this sort of community-style living. So your background is very much in community living. Now your mother was a believer, wasn't she? But not your father. How did that work out?
Well, my mother, she came to the land in order to study Hebrew, to study the Bible. She became a believer as a young adult, and after her studies she came to the land just to study Hebrew, and that's where she met my dad. And my dad was not a believer, and so when I was growing up, it was, I guess, mixed home in that sense. I would hear from my mom about God and from my dad about evolution, and that was how I grew up.
How have you got such a strong faith today? What happened?
Oh, wow. I think I knew God, I guess, from a very young age. I always knew He was there. I spoke to Him. When I was 7 years old, my mom shared with me about Yeshua, about Jesus, and the whole gospel, and that's where I really came to faith. And growing up in the land, my father wasn't a believer at the time, and no one in the kibbutz obviously was, and no one in my class was, and so it was always a very big challenge. I would be asked about different things and had to have answers, and didn't necessarily have like set answers that I studied. I had to study it on my own. We didn't go to a congregation for the longest time just because my father wasn't a believer, and my mom she didn't want to go, just her and I, and so the only believers I knew were my mom and then later on my younger siblings.
Maybe it was your mother sending you to the King's Kids camps in the summer. These were camps run for Jewish believing children and also Arab Christian children that really encouraged you enormously and taught you a lot.
Yeah, the main fellowship I had outside of just my mother was in the kids camps, and that was the first camp I ever went to. I think I was 10 at the time. I started going to the King's Kids summer camps, and that was an amazing experience, getting to know other believers my age and just studying about God and fellowship, and those were really amazing times, life-changing. When I was 16, I went to one of the King's Kids camps, and we had a 24-hour prayer time, and each group took a shift, and we had a list of things we were praying for, things for the country and things for our families as well. And my sister and I, we asked prayer for our father, who wasn't a believer, and we asked for his salvation, and people were praying for him. And when we got back from the camp, that was when my father noticed how much this faith and this experience changed our lives. And so he decided we should start going to a congregation. He told my mom she should start taking us to a congregation. And my mom said, well, you're the head of the family, so that's your job. And that's how we actually started going to a congregation. So that was when I was 16, and that was an amazing experience, really.
So your father became a believer too. You have been through the Israeli army, as all young Israelis do. What sort of an experience was that for you?
The army experience is, probably one of the hardest experiences. Even though I grew up a lot of the time with not a lot of fellowship and a lot of believers around me on the daily basis, the army is something very different. It is you're completely immersed in basically a secular society, day in, day out, and you're trained to do very very specific things, and it is very, very hard to keep up any disciplines of daily quiet time, reading the scripture. I mean, you have no time, and in basic training especially, and actually during the army service was one of the hardest experiences I had, and because it is so intense and so long, the army turns into like your whole life. And even though I went into the army very, very strong in my faith, by the time I got to the end of my army service, I had no doubt in God, but I had no communication with Him anymore. I was spiritually in a desert I did not know how to get out of.
How did you come through post-army then? What did you do?
Well, what happened during the last months of my army service, when I realized where I was spiritually, I wanted to return to God, and I started very intentionally, at every opportunity I had, listening to worship music and just listening to it over and over again. And even though my heart felt very hard and I felt like I couldn't pray at all, I would listen to the worship music. And after a few weeks of that, God just broke through and opened my ears and opened my heart, and it was an amazing experience of His grace, absolutely amazing. And after I got out of the army, I was asked to help out with a discipleship program called Lech Lecha, and that's how. Actually, through the daily scheduled quiet times and times of prayer together and worship and fellowship and study of the Word, God just brought me back in a huge way, which was an amazing grace.
Let's talk about Lech Lecha, because this is a discipleship program for young believers, for both Jewish believers and Arab Christians. And one of the aspects of it is that you take groups to Africa, and you have led one of these groups. What can you share what happened?
Wow. Well, 2.5 years ago, I was with a group that went out to Africa, and it was we had the opportunity to serve in the congregations in the churches of Uganda. We had actually a group of pastors came to the land and toured the land with Lech Lecha right before for 3 weeks, and then a group of young Israelis returned with them back to Uganda, and we went to their churches and spoke. We spoke about the Bible. We spoke about Israel. It was an amazing experience. They many places we reached, it was places that they've never seen white people before, let alone Israelis, people from the Holy Land, which was very exciting for them. It was an amazing opportunity to be able to share God's faithfulness and how, despite all these years, the the places where the Bible stories happen, they're real, and we've seen it, and we've been there, and God's faithfulness to Israel is consistent, and it's still he still is faithful, and he is bringing about his will, and it was an amazing opportunity, and also the opportunity to see what God is doing in other places in the world was very exciting.
For you, is taking a team to a place like Uganda part of Israel being a light to the nations? Is that your understanding?
Yeah, it is part of Israel's calling, and it's an amazing privilege. I feel like it's more in what God has done in us than in what we have to give. When we went, it felt for me. It was a sense as if those who came, the pastors who came to Israel, were actually bringing back with them the fruit of the land, like the spies in the story with Joshua and Caleb, who brought out the fruit to show what amazing plans God has, and how He is faithful, and He has this amazing future. And that's in the very thing that God has done, and where He has put us. It's not in something we necessarily have to say or to do, but it's just in what God has done, and to be a witness to that.
Shahal, a young Israeli woman sharing her story. And you're listening to The Olive Tree with me, Julia Fisher. The Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund is a Christian charity based in the UK that supports the needs of both Jewish and Arab Christians living in the Holy Land, especially those involved in reconciliation. So if you'd like to know more about our work and receive our free bi-monthly newsletter, please either visit our website, www.olivetreefund.org, or write to me, Julia Fisher, at the Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund, P.O. Box 850, Horsham, RH12 9GA, that's in the UK. Do join me at the same time next week for another story from the Olive Tree. Until then, goodbye.